Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the break. We had a chance to have a few informal conversations, which we're delighted about, and we'll be happy to continue afterwards. I'm going to turn it back to Kim to finish out our presentation. We want to show you a short video of people who've been injured and have died from Gardasil, and then Emily will talk about her experience in the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers.
So just to close out this slide, Japan, not only are there lawsuits in Japan, they don't have class actions, but they have something similar to class actions. The Japanese government actually de-recommended Gardasil shortly after it went on the market there because of injuries that girls were suffering. You can still get it technically in Japan, but you have to private pay for it. It's no longer on the recommended list of vaccines from the Japanese government. Ireland is such a hotbed. There are groups of parents there who are so fierce in fighting for their kids, and their kids have suffered so terribly, but the Irish government has actually called those parents emotional terrorists.
Wow.
Things are really tough for the Irish moms and dads over there. And it's tough everywhere, it's tough here, but to hear yourself called an emotional terrorist has to really be very difficult. So we wanted to talk a little bit about what's going on in science now, both what independent scientists are finding and reporting, and the epidemiology upon which those who are promoting the vaccine rely, and some problems with that epidemiology so that you can know when someone says to you, well, we know it doesn't cause autoimmune disease, here's a study. We'll show you some of the problems with those large population-based studies. This was a study that came out, it's a meta-review. It came out in, I think, November of last year. It's done on a worldwide basis. The doctors who were involved in the study and researchers, Svetlana Blichstein is an autonomic disorder specialist up in upstate New York. Louise Brinth is a Danish scientist. Jeannie Hendrickson is an MD at Yale University. And Manuel Martinez-Lavan is a Mexican scientist and researcher. They looked at studies of autonomic dysfunction, autoimmune type conditions, post-orthotic tachycardia syndrome, things that girls are reporting, we hear about here, that girls are reporting. They looked worldwide and found that there really was consistency in the injuries that girls and now boys are reporting worldwide. And they applied really rigorous scientific criteria called the Bradford Hill criteria in their assessment, looking for those similarities, looking for those potential associations, and found really strong associations. And their conclusion was that there's substantial evidence from case series reported from various countries that the HPV vaccine may be associated with phenotypic syndromes that share common pathogenesis involving the autonomic nervous system, potentially including underlying autoimmune processes. And that's what we see reported so much. Even some of the cardiac conditions that are reported have an autoimmune basis to them. There's a lot of autoimmune symptomology that's being reported. One of the issues with autoimmune disease is that it's really hard to get a diagnosis. Often it can take years to get a diagnosis. And your symptoms may start small and you may not even realize it may be associated with something bigger. But then the symptoms keep increasing and worsening. You'll see that the way the autoimmune process works is a problem for the epidemiology upon which doctors who are promoting the vaccine and others rely. But these girls can take years to get a diagnosis, and even if you just go to the autoimmune support group and advocacy organizations, they'll tell you it can be very difficult to get a diagnosis. There is a US doctor named Rebecca Chandler who actually works at the WHO-funded Uppsala Monitoring Center in Scandinavia, who talks about the difficulty of how adverse events are reported and collected, and that many of the young people who are injured have many autoimmune symptoms, but they may not have a diagnosis. And so they're not being collected if all you're collecting is diagnoses. So you're missing a huge body of potentially vaccine-injured young people. So Mary's going to take this, I think, in a minute for the cancer piece. But we talked about that negative efficacy, and that if you currently have an infection and have antibodies evidence of a prior infection, you're at a 44.6% greater risk of developing CIN 2, 3, or worse. If you have one or the other, you're at, I believe, a 30% greater risk, about 30%. Nancy Miller, if you pull out that 464-page document that I love so much, the clinical review, Nancy Miller's the lead person on that clinical review for Gardasil. And in May 2006, May 19th, the day after the advisory committee at FDA who approved Gardasil approved it, or had their hearing, she came out and said, Gardasil doesn't necessarily protect against one or more of the 4 viruses in people already infected and can increase their risk for precursors to cervical cancer. This has been out there literally since the day they approved this thing.
So as we mentioned before, the clinical trials showed that if you had an active HPV infection with one of the types that's in the vaccine, or if you had the antibodies to it, you were going to be at increased risk of abnormal cervical growth or cervical cancer. And that's what the epidemiological evidence today is showing. In the countries that have had high uptake of the HPV vaccine, we don't know this in each individual, but on a population basis, which vaccine people love to talk about, what we see, for instance, here in England, is that starting in 2008, where there was really a rollout, and this one was with the Cervarix vaccine, Glaxo's product, you see now in these women who are now in their 20s, right, 20 to 25 to 29, you see this dramatic uptake in cervical cancer cases, right? This vaccine is supposed to prevent cervical cancer, and here is this published peer-reviewed study showing that the rate is dramatically increasing. In the younger women, not so much, but several years out. Here's evidence from Sweden. This is from a French pair of scientists, the Delphines, who have not yet peer-reviewed published this, but they've made this available on the internet. This is showing other high uptake countries and what's happening with cervical cancer rates. So this is evidence from Sweden, going here from 2007 as their baseline to 2015, right? You'd hope that this was going to be going down, instead it's going up. Here's their evidence in Australia. The immunizations are not going down, they're going up. And the United States, we're starting to see evidence that it's going up. And yet in France, where there was very low uptake, interestingly, it was recommended, but not much uptake, about 15% uptake of the HPV vaccines in France, the rate is still continuing to go down. We're not seeing. So this is sort of the de facto developed country control, which did not have high uptake of HPV vaccines. Autoimmunity.
So I talked a minute ago about the Blitzstein study and about autoimmunity and about how hard it is to diagnose autoimmune disease. So this is one of the big studies upon which those who are recommending the vaccine rely to suggest that it doesn't cause autoimmunity. Surveillance of autoimmune conditions following routine use of quadrivalent human papillomavirus vaccine. It was a big study, but they only followed the subjects for 180 days after each dose, so 6 months after each dose, and they only looked specifically for diagnoses of 16 pre-specified autoimmune conditions. So even if you had the symptoms of one of those 16 but didn't have a diagnosis, you weren't counted. And given that it can take years to get a diagnosis, 6 months after is not a long time to follow anyone at all. Similarly, This was a study from Canada. They used Ontario's health database and looked at it from 2007 to 2013. They looked for autoimmune disorders diagnosed 7 to 60 days post-vaccination. And based on, and for a dozen specific disorders that are listed there. So if you weren't diagnosed within 60 days, you weren't counted. And again, this is one of the big studies that's relied on to say that there's no link between autoimmunity and Gardasil vaccination. So the reason Mary and Eileen and I did this book is for Chris, absolutely, for Maddie Mormon, who committed suicide, for Yoel Gomez, who was a football player, an active, bright kid who died following vaccination, for Colton Barrett, who committed suicide following vaccination after having obviously catastrophic injuries, and for Alexis Wolf, who's still alive, but whose life has been permanently changed. She has seizures on a daily basis. Her intellectual functioning level went down to, she's in fourth grade, around fourth grade level or lower. Now she had been a bright, active girl. For Elijah Bunch, for every kid who's been injured, that's why we do this.
Yeah, that's why we all do it. For every kid who's been injured and died. Thank you. Well, I left off where I had obtained an attorney, Mark Sadaka, and he filed our case in April 2010. It took 4.5 years before we had a hearing. Now, we were the lucky ones because lots of people don't even get a hearing. Cases are thrown out. Statute of limitations expired. If you concurrently get another vaccine with Gardasil, or if you're on a medication, that confounds your case. Probably it'll get thrown out, be hard to prove. I know a mom whose case got as far as they had their hearing. She had a very strong case, and then a paper came out about problems with antibiotics. Well, her daughter had an antibiotic when she got the vaccine, so her case was dead. You know. So anyway, we were lucky to get that far, and we had a burden of proof. So our burden of proof consisted of 3 things. In the vaccine court, you have to show a temporal relationship to vaccination and the injury or the death. Secondly, you have to show a medically plausible explanation as to how that vaccine could have caused that injury or death. And the third is you have to show a logical sequence of events. Now, the most difficult of those 3 things is establishing a medically plausible explanation. So, to support our investigation, our attorney hired 2 world-class experts. Dr. Michael Eldar, who's a world-class electrophysiologist and cardiologist, and Dr. Yehuda Schoenfeld, who's a world-class immunologist. He asked them to review our case to see, if they thought we had a case, if they could see anything. And after reviewing the medical, her symptoms, the medical evidence we had, her records, and a plethora of peer-reviewed studies, they felt that we were prepared to go to court. So based on this evidence, we finally we went to court, and it was in Washington, D.C., at the Court of Federal Claims. Now, that's not a regular courtroom. There's no judge, there's no jury, I know I saw somebody shake their head, what, no judge? Nope. There's no discovery. You go into a courtroom that's kind of like an administrative hearing. And the government appoints an administrative guy called a special master, and he hears your evidence, and he determines if you've met your burden of proof. So based on the evidence we had, experts from both sides, and in the courtroom then, those who were present were me and my attorney and my 2 experts, and the government, their attorney and their 2 experts, and the special master. So based on the medical evidence, both experts agreed that Christina likely died from an arrhythmia. The autopsy report and the echocardiogram had both shown she didn't have any structural problems. So the experts agreed that it was most likely due to the rhythm of the heart, which was the area of expertise for Dr. Michael Eldar. So on review of Chris's ECGs, those 2 that she had when she saw her primary doctor for the baseline intake, based on that evidence, they agreed that the arrhythmia was a ventricular premature complex, not an atrial premature complex. The primary care physician had originally diagnosed her with PACs, premature atrial contracts, and had considered them of low clinical significance. As a result, her primary care doctor's erroneous diagnosis made the arrhythmia seem like something that didn't need any follow-up. She should have been put on given a stress test and a Holter monitor test to detect electrical irregularities rather than investigations into the heart structure. We don't know if Chris would have lived had that been done, but we would have been more aware, and who knows. And Dr. Eldar argued further that the morphology, or the shape of the printout from the ECG was consistent with the ventricular premature complexes, and that likely led to her death. So the cardiologists from the government did not disagree with that. So they were in agreement that that was the likely cause of her death. And on further investigation of her record, they determined that prior to her Gardasil vaccination, she had no history of arrhythmias reported. And her death was, so there was a dose-response relationship that seemed apparent, that it appeared for the first time after vaccination and reappeared subsequently. We kept giving her the shots. And it was in clear temporal relationship. It was 18 days she died after her last shot. Okay, so if they agree that it was arrhythmia, what was the medically plausible explanation as to how the vaccine caused the arrhythmia? Well, that's where Dr. Yehuda Schoenfeld, the immunologist, became very involved, and he described in detail the mechanism by which Gardasil could have caused that fatal arrhythmia through molecular mimicry. Now what that means is that the L1 protein in the HPV vaccine shares similarity with the L-type calcium channel receptor in the heart. So because of the molecular mimicry, and probably many of you are familiar with how autoimmune systems work, the body begins to attack your own cells, or in this case, the antigens for the L1 protein were attacking and bound to the L-type calcium channels, which caused them to dysregulate the influx of calcium, and the influx, therefore, affects the rhythm of your heart. And this led to the premature ventricular contractions, triggering the fatal arrhythmia. And peer-reviewed papers supported this theory. The government experts had no alternative explanation. Their main argument was that 100 million doses of Gardasil had been distributed worldwide, and if there was a real risk of sudden death, vaccine surveillance programs surely would have picked it up. So our experts pointed out, acknowledged problems with the deficiencies in the reporting system and how calculations based on the number of vaccines distributed, as opposed to those actually given, underestimate the vaccine-associated adverse events by at least 7-fold. So our experts had demonstrated after 2 days of testimony that we had a medically plausible mechanism of cause and effect, showing that the vaccine could have caused the injury. Secondly, we had a temporal relationship between vaccination and injury. Thirdly, we had previous precedents where the same vaccine caused the same type of injury within the same time frame. And finally, there was a lack of any reasonable alternative explanation. So as the hearing ended, I felt pretty good. We had met our burden of proof, and I was anticipating a judgment in our favor. So it took the special master about 1 year and 4 months to get his decision back to us, and he ruled against us. He challenged that Chris's arrhythmia started after Gardasil, and he also challenged the authority of the peer-reviewed scientific articles our experts introduced in support of their theory of their theorized mechanism of injury. Well, my attorney and I were astounded. The special master had ignored the evidence, had distorted our theory of causation, misread her records, made unsupported factual statements. And so we submitted an appeal and said that he was arbitrary and capricious, and his decision was not in accordance with the law. So the appeal was accepted, and then the case went to a judge. So the judge had the case for 1 year, and actually it changed during that year from one judge to the other. But at the end of about 1 year and 3 months, the judge wrote a 22-page critique of the special master's decision, and she found him to have errors of judgment and errors of law. For example, she said there were 30 specific medical appointments prior to vaccination where no arrhythmia had been reported, and that the injuries only appeared after vaccination. She also determined that we had met our burden of proof regarding challenge-re-challenge, that those injuries got worse with each injection, and a biologically plausible explanation causally connecting the vaccine with death. So on June 30th, 2017, so this is now 7 years later, the judge vacated the special master's decision, and she remanded the case back to the special master to re-decide based on the evidence and the law. On remand, the special master reversed his decision, stating we had met our burden of proof regarding challenge-re-challenge, and that ultimately, because of the finding that Chris's arrhythmia began after HPV vaccination, Ms. Tarsell has presented preponderant evidence of a logical sequence of cause and effect connecting the vaccination to the arrhythmia, and Ms. Tarsell is entitled to compensation. But that wasn't the end of it. after there's a decision by the special master, the government gets an opportunity to appeal. So they had 6 months to appeal, and they did not. So it's very telling that they chose not to appeal the case, and they thereby conceded, the Department of Health and Human Services conceded, that by preponderant evidence that Chris died from her HPV vaccines. The whole journey took 8 years. We could have settled. They made an offer early on. There have been other death cases where they did accept a settlement. But for me, this was about holding them accountable. I would have gone to the ends of the earth, 100 years, whatever it would take. But we won, and if you can call it that. And this has opened the door for other claims to proceed because there is at least one established causal connection with a medically plausible explanation. So I was asked also to talk a little bit about my current activism and also, some thoughts about what might be done, and then open it up to question and answer. I think there's a short video that will show other victims as well. In terms of activism, like many of you, I learned the hard way. And once your eyes are opened, you do everything you can to increase awareness. So, as I said, I had joined in by IC and VIC. That study that I talked about is posted on my website. I created the website. It's good for people who don't know anything. That website doesn't go into the depth, Mary and Kim and Kim's book. But, for laymen and for a quick view of cause and effect, this was created now, 9 years ago. And there's a lot of information, and that was one of the things that I did. But I wrote articles, gave talks, 3 sane vax. I was interviewed on a Katie Couric show at one point. I don't know if you know Katie's story, but she had the courage to investigate the HPV vaccine on national TV. She brought experts from both sides, and it was very balanced, the presentation. She got tremendous flack. She was accused of being a fearmonger. And at that point, we didn't have a decision, so I could not be as open about what happened to Chris. But nevertheless, I don't know if Katie got tremendous pushback, and she had to have the CDC on the following week to say the vaccine was safe and effective. And her show ended about a month later. I don't have evidence that's related to her doing that, because her show is going to go off the air in June, but I don't know. Anyway, I won't go through all the things. I do like all of you do, go testify, write letters and so forth. We did have a bill that we submitted in Maryland to try to have a supplemental form to the vaccine information sheet for Gardasil to increase awareness about what you should know. What you should know about cancer, what you should know about HPVs, what you should know about the vaccine, what you should know about risk. And unfortunately, and not unexpectedly, it died in committee. We will go back, but one of the reasons they said they killed it was that it wasn't in agreement with the things that were on the CDC's vaccine information sheet. There was information there that it would confuse the public. So, the other thing that I'm currently involved with as an activist is a study that I started a couple years after Chris's death, It takes a deep dive into the vaccine adverse event reporting system for Gardasil and comes up with some pretty astounding discoveries with regard to the reporting of serious adverse events. It was reviewed and it was to be published, and just at the time of publishing, somebody blocked it. So we are currently hoping we will find another avenue to get that information out there. I was hoping I could share that with you today, but you know, and then we have also been doing things with the governor's office and the state's attorney general's office. So in terms of what you all can do, I think even there are four main areas where advocacy seems to be going forward. Of course, the most important of these is sharing information, and what you're all doing here and what the Informed Choice Washington group is doing and what groups around the country are doing. Let each one teach one. So you're each taking notes and you're going to go back and you're going to spread awareness. And that's incredibly important, as well as your fight to continue to maintain freedom of choice. There's the legal front. Things are happening there, as Mary talked about and Kim talked about, in other countries. And that's very exciting, and we'll all keep our eyes on that. A delegation from Japan came to the United States a couple of weeks ago. They met with Mary, they met with my attorney, they met with me. They're going all around getting information to go back and support their claims. And we wish them well. A third front is the research, so we want to support all those papers that are helping to make this burgeoning group of documents that they won't be able to ignore. And then there's the legislative arena. So, you know, I think even in the conversation we had here, I was talking to a young woman who's in training as a midwife, and she told me that their national organization gathers data, and she said, I look at cervixes all the time. So I said, well, that's a good opportunity maybe to gather data about if you're seeing HPVs, they do HPV testing, and if that correlates to whether that person was HPV vaccinated, and they could gather this data, and since we expect a rising tide of cancers and HPV, you know, that could present data to state health organizations. So things like that, by talking to each other, maybe you can come up with ideas to move things forward. But in closing, I just want to conclude that, you know, my daughter gave me the gift of wisdom, opened my eyes, and as Einstein once said, blind belief in authority is the greatest enemy of truth. So may you know the truth and be well. Thank you.
We have a video to show here quickly. Let me see if I can get it on full screen. Mary, do you know? Oh, hold on. Let me get to pause. Do any of you know a description of this video that we're about to do?
Yeah. So a group called Health Choice, which I think Informed Choice Washington works with. It's a national umbrella. Both Kim and I are on the, you know, sort of advisory boards for that. They worked with SaneVax, which is a very important advocacy group headed by a woman named Norma Erickson. We talk about her at length in our book. They collaborated together to reach out to victims of HPV vaccination around the country. And this video has been seen tens of thousands of times. I actually was involved in a briefing on Capitol Hill in Congress where we showed this. That briefing was so effective that they canceled the hearing that was going to follow the briefing. But this is interviews with young women and with the moms and others of young women who died.
That's for the mic. Can you put the mic by the microphone, by the speaker? No, put the mic by the speaker on the computer. Use the hard chair that doesn't spin. If you stand on the hard chair that she's sitting on, then you should. That's better.
In this morning's Health Watch, understanding HPV, the human papillomavirus, the numbers are alarming. It affects about 80% of all women by the age of 50.
This is skip to a different video.
All right, sorry guys.
HPV may be the most common sexually transmitted infection, but it's also the least understood.
Oh, this is sort of interesting to
hear.
Yeah, I know.
Whenever you see the word debunking, get scared.
Here we go.
My name is Jessica Faye Erickson.
My name is Elisa Depford.
My name is Christina Tarcell.
My name is Megan. I'm a newlywed, and I'm a college freshman. I was a senior at the Quadrivalent School. I was a healthy, vibrant, and fun-loving individual.
I was an honor student in art and philosophy.
Before Gardasil, I loved to play soccer and softball. I loved basketball, cheerleading, anything to do with the outdoors. After watching my sister have an ultrasound, while she was carrying her child, I found my passion. I wanted to watch life grow in the early stages.
Before Gardasil, I was always out in nature, swimming, biking, playing all kinds of sports.
Before Gardasil, I loved photography, swimming, hiking, biking, and overall loved doing fun things.
I played on the tennis team, and I was art editor of the campus literary magazine.
I dreamt of becoming a mom. My doctor recommended Gardasil medicine. She gave me all the right reasons
to find treatments for medical symptoms and diagnoses following Gardasil?
Because I am worth it and I'm not a coincidence.
Because you're worth it, and it's not a coincidence.
I am worth it, and I am not a coincidence.
My life was worth living, and my death is not a coincidence.
My life was taken from me by a vaccine I didn't even need.
We need to stop and we need to be held accountable for what they've done.
I am not a coincidence. I am worth it. I am not a number. I am a human being.
Anybody else have questions written down? Here, I've got one, that's the one here. Did everybody that pre-registered for the book get their book already? I have a couple.
Well, let's see, let's maybe take a minute to look through the questions. Okay, this is helpful. All right, so we each need to go through. Yeah.
So thank you all for your kind attention. I know it's already been a long morning, but so we have a number of questions. What we thought we would do is we'd each take a question, go down the row, and come back again. So here's one that I took. Are clinical trials conducted by the manufacturer? Isn't this the fox guarding the hen house? Yes, this is the fox guarding the hen house. All of the testing is done by the manufacturer, who's either promoting the drug or the biologic, the vaccine. The FDA does no independent science. They are reviewing the science by the manufacturer. And, you know, is that the way it should be? No, it should be that there's some independent science, but there's not. And in fact, the manufacturer is not obligated to turn over to the regulator all of the science. If they do an experiment that they don't like, they're not required to give that over to the FDA. So some things are put in the drawer, and that's a common criticism of the whole clinical trial process, being very biased towards licensure.
And this is sort of a follow-up similar question. Should research studies be considered flawed or suspicious if funded by Big Pharma or if researchers are employed by Big Pharma? Again, it certainly creates the impression that there may be bias there, and I think it's one of the factors that we need to look at when we're assessing studies. There's a lot you need to look at. You know, we talked about those autoimmune studies. You need to look at the data that's there, not just the conclusions. But if labs are funded by the pharmaceutical industry, there's certainly at least an incentive to come up with results that may be favorable to your funding source. That doesn't mean that every study is flawed, but I certainly think it, is something that has to be considered and that we should consider when we're assessing the quality of studies that are out there.
So this question is, how many more deaths and injuries will it take for Gardasil to be pulled off the market? Are we making any headway? Well, Chris was the 23rd death reported, and now we have 460 at least. So I don't know how many more deaths it'll take. But I think that we are making progress in terms of increased awareness. And I think one indication of that is that there's greater pushback from Pharma. They are pouring money into medical associations across the nation and pushing like crazy to change the story. So one could see that as their defensiveness. And there has been, for example, in Japan, uptake is now only 1%. So in other countries, though, they're making more progress in other countries, but you all are going to help spread the word, and I think among professionals that there's more networking as well.
What's the uptake in the U.S.?
Well, they want it to be 70%. In Maryland, I think it was around 40%. Different states have different rates of uptake.
I think the last statistics we saw when we were looking at this was overall 60%, but I believe that's for the first shot. It goes down shot after shot, and sometimes it's because of systemic side effects, but also we've been told by girls that it's really one of the most painful vaccines they've ever received, and I think sometimes people don't go back just for that reason.
And I just, on that point of the number of vaccines, it's really unusual that a manufacturer would ever go from recommending 3 doses to 2 doses, right? For people under 15. What's typical is for DTaP, it goes from 3 doses to 4 doses to 5 doses. There's discussion about a 3rd dose of MMR. Hepatitis B's gone up, chickenpox has gone up. So you have to at least ask the question, why would Merck be foregoing income for a 3rd dose that they recommend? They say that's only based on effectiveness, but you have to at least wonder, is this because there's more injuries after the 3rd dose, and they're catastrophic injuries, and they're obvious injuries? So you just at least have to ask that question. So I have another question about the injury compensation program, and people said that I have said in several interviews, I don't like calling it vaccine court. I don't. I always call it the vaccine injury compensation program. As Emily said, it's not a court. There's not a judge. There's not a jury. There's not formal rules of civil procedure. There's not discovery as of right. All of the things that we rely on in courts are not there. This was set up by Congress in its wisdom in 1986 to be fast, to be fair, to be non-adversarial, to be simple. And it was set up so that people would automatically be compensated. They would say, oh, my kid got this or that symptom within 5 days, my kid died within 2 days, pay me out. It's obviously a vaccine injury. And they understood in 1986 that there were going to be about 0.5% of children who would be severely injured or would die. That was the decision that Congress made for children in the United States. Obviously, what really happened is they gave almost blanket liability protection to the pharmaceutical industry that was making vaccines, and the number of vaccines on the federally recommended schedule went from 7 to 16. And the HPV vaccine that we're talking about is really the gateway vaccine to the next generation of vaccines. Anti-cancer vaccines, anti-obesity, anti-addiction, all of those are in the pipeline. And so that's really part of the reason why Kim and Eileen and I focused on the HPV vaccine, because it really is the most egregious. And one of the other things that's really unique about it is, unlike most vaccines, they're given to infants and young children where they can't really describe what's going on, and you don't have a baseline. They're not artists, they're not in college, they're not athletes. The injuries for the HPV vaccine are much more striking in teenagers.
Mary, question there. You mentioned all the differences between the vaccine court and a regular court. But how about, are precedents recorded and set? Like, for instance, is Emily in Chris's case, then does that now create a precedent of which others with exact same symptoms can follow?
So, I'll come back. Another question is what happens outside of the vaccine injury. Yes, it is a precedent that now a death has been attributed as more likely than not due to Gardasil. But in reality, every person's symptoms are unique. So an arrhythmia case may be able to rely heavily on that. And somebody who's using exactly that theory is going to be able to rely on that. But let's say somebody has a different, an autoimmune disorder, and they die from that autoimmune disorder, they're not necessarily going to be able to look to that as particularly valuable precedent.
Or even, as Emily mentioned, even if someone had symptomology very similar and medical history similar, if they were taking antibiotics at the same time, that creates a confounding factor. So you'd need something really factually very, very similar. So I was asked, how are clinical trial participants motivated to participate? Money. Money. We know from the girls in Denmark, they were paid a small amount of money to participate in the trial. But these were, young girls who were, students. Money. They need money to, buy food, pay their rent, all those things. People are also motivated by non-monetary factors. We know that some people genuinely want to help. They think they're doing a good thing. For other types of trials, for example, end-stage cancer treatments, people are motivated by the desire to live. There are a lot of things that motivate people. In poor countries where parents say they want to get their children vaccinated, and they're offered they know the placebo's another vaccine, they may take that because they think they're getting protection for their child that way. So there are a lot of factors, but for clinical trials, there generally is some monetary payment made available to the participants.
Just follow up on the comment about our case. Yes, if there's another arrhythmia, it can be helpful to that case. But also it was based on the theory of molecular mimicry. And in that regard, if that becomes a theory of plausible mechanism, it could be used for other reference for other types of autoimmune disorders based on that theory. Anyway, this question is, best way to encourage more medical professionals to speak up. Oh, that's it. You tell me. What medical professionals do we have here that can speak to that?
I'd like to say something about that. I'm a functional neurologist. About a third of my patients are children who were childhood developmental disorders. So, about 10 years ago, do I need a mic?
Yeah.
So I practice in Woodinville, and a lot of my practice, about a third of my practice is children with childhood developmental disorders. And I've been in practice 23 years, but about 10 years ago, I really was focusing on this. And a woman came in and I said, well, when did this start? She said, the day of the MMR-based vaccine, I forget how many months. And she told me this story, and her daughter, I don't know if you guys are familiar with the ATEC score of autism. She had a 79, like 100 is the worst, 0 to 10 is within normal, neurotypical. She had a 79 on the ATEC scale. This girl couldn't even pour herself a glass of water. She was ruined. Her life was ruined. So this mom was on a rampage, and I thought to myself, I've been anti-vaccine. I hate to say that in this room, but you get ostracized as a healthcare practitioner. So if I was open about this to everyone in my practice, people would not come to me, and other people would not refer to me. So this is what I do. When people come in, I very neutrally say, do you believe that a vaccination had anything to do with your child's condition? In a very neutral sort of way. And then people go, yes, I did. But I told the pediatrician, they said it couldn't possibly have anything to do with the vaccine. And they look at the spouse and they go, see? Do you have other people say that? And this opens up a door for them. And you're not stating anything or accusing anybody, but if you just state the facts, most of my parents who have autistic children tell me, they report to me that they're autistic because of a vaccine. And when you hear 100 of these stories, you will never vaccinate again.
You sound like Dr. Wakefield. That's how
Thank you.
That's exactly how he got started, because he saw it in his own patients. Can you please tell me your name?
No, Candace, not now. Not now, we're on video. Yeah.
Along that line, I'm going to share a little experience I had this past March. There was a symposium. It was titled HPV Vaccines, Doctors Are the Key. And they're really going after doctors, and this symposium was all about how to increase uptake, and they're offering bonuses, $5,000 bonus, want you to create competition among staff, offer them a bottle of wine, publish the results. Don't discuss the vaccine, sandwich it in between two mandated vaccines and tell them it's time for your vaccinations, that kind of thinking. And handing out literature that was saying the new message is HPV vaccine is cancer prevention. And that's, you know, publicized on buses and everything. So I'm at this meeting and they're talking about how it's safe and effective, and I raised my hand and I said, my daughter died from the vaccine. And the ponderance of evidence was that we showed in the vaccine court, sorry Mary, I called it vaccine court. She died from the vaccine. And the woman on stage, who was a Merck consultant and also a physician, head of a department down in Orlando, Florida, stood on the stage, pointed at me and said, this is what you all have to contend with, a anti-vaxxer. End of discussion, no empathy for what happened. However, during the lunch break, some physicians came up to me and shared their stories, like you're saying. So I guess it will be undercover, but physicians will address that. Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of times that physicians aren't even getting that much training about vaccines in medical school. They're not reading the package inserts. They don't know what's on there. They don't know. We've had many physicians where we've had conversations and said, for vaccines that are recommended for children in the United States, there aren't placebo-controlled clinical trials. And they say, of course there are. And I say, well, no, they're not. Let's go through the package inserts. I can show you every single one of them. None of them has a placebo. Some don't even have a control. Some were tested in a couple hundred kids for a few days following vaccination. And they're almost invariably shocked to learn that. And I think that that can also open inroads. And then as Mary mentioned earlier, doctors aren't trained on how to recognize vaccine injuries either. So it's difficult. It's difficult. Yes.
So I'm a nurse and pediatric nurse, and I really the question of how we can maybe make a difference with physicians. Nurses are the educators most of the time in those appointments. So and oftentimes I think the physicians are afraid of being held accountable to whatever their recommendations are for the CDC. They are liable for sharing information and pushing and encouraging things because it's not a law. It's maybe Washington State, but it's sort of it's what they're held accountable to. They're afraid.
Standard of care.
They're afraid of getting sued. They're afraid of losing their practice. They're afraid of losing patients, their reputation. But nurses don't have that same standard, and so I'm wondering if kind of amongst this to be able to have some sort of thought process about how to educate nurses better, so that nurses can be those advocates and question, and starting with a neutral statement and encouraging thought and curiosity in patients instead of just sort of saying, well, my doctor said it, so, and not realizing that their doctor's really held to a different standard than the nurses are.
That's a great idea. Thank you for sharing that.
The one problem the nurse may have, like they were saying at this symposium for doctors, they're going to track each nurse and see which vaccines are given, if the nurses are, falling down on what the recommended vaccinations are, and they're encouraging that this be publicized. So if you work, like say in a clinic setting, anyway, that was the direction that they were suggesting for practices.
I just want to add a note to that. I'm going to be in Pennsylvania in the capital, Harrisburg, next week, where a representative is introducing legislation that physicians cannot get kickbacks from the pharmaceutical industry for a high number of and it's the draft legislation. I don't know that it'll pass, but it may be a model for all of our states. It also would outlaw physicians from dismissing from their practices unvaccinated or partially vaccinated children. So it may be the laws that are really going to discipline the practice, right? The physicians. Yeah.
I'm just curious what representative.
His name is Metcalf, Daryl Metcalf. He's a representative, and there's going to be a press conference next Tuesday in Pennsylvania. Hope. Letting you know on the inside.
When you say kickbacks, does that include bonuses?
That's what I mean by bonuses.
Okay.
So in other words, people, let me take a step back. So it's the case for many vaccines, I assume including Gardasil, although I don't know this for a fact with Gardasil. But in many pediatric practices, if a physician has an uptake rate of 80% or 90% of everybody in the practice for, let's say, the flu vaccine or the second dose of the chickenpox vaccine, whatever it is, they will get a monetary bonus, but they won't get it if the practice falls below that threshold. So in other words, the doctor is financially incentivized to give the vaccine and arguably overlooking risk factors for those individual kids, even when the vaccine is not mandated, even if it's contraindicated. Yeah.
So insurance companies probably pay for a lot of these, and so tell me how, I know they're part of forcing the uptake or encouraging the uptake, but it's costing them money, so how is that?
So many of us wonder, why is there not a wedge between pharma and insurance? Insurance is paying for this. Insurance is in on this at this point, and so remember that we didn't talk about it, it's in the book, but 50% of vaccines for children in this country are paid for by the US government. It's called the Vaccines for Children program. And the vaccines are subsidized. I attended a meeting with Dorella and Bernadette where they were talking about the prices that Washington would pay for vaccines under the Vaccines for Children. Anything that's been federally recommended gets purchased by Vaccines for Children. So Gardasil is purchased by Vaccines for Children. That's accounting for all the kids in clinics, all the kids who are on Medicaid, and it's basically 50%. The other 50% is covered by insurance, and it's private pay, but it's covered by insurance. And why is it that insurers are not clued in? I can't explain it to you. It doesn't make any sense to me, except to say that insurance is working with the pharmaceutical industry, and they're all part of the same industry, and they don't really view it separately. So I have a question here. How is it possible to sue a vaccine manufacturer outside of the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program? So the story is you have to first, within 2 years of a death, 3 years of an injury, sue in the Vaccine Injury Compensation Program. If you don't do that, you're totally out of luck. You can never bring your claim anywhere else in the country. If you did file, and let's say you lose, or even if you win, you have the right to take your claim outside of the Injury Compensation Program to any other state or federal court. But when you do that, you're going to have to pay your own attorney. You're going to have to find an attorney who's going to be willing to sue the pharmaceutical industry, which is not very easy. And you're going to have to mount a very aggressive legal argument that the vaccine, caused death. That is now happening in this case in California that I mentioned to you, Roby versus Merck. And you can read a little bit more about that case on the website of Children's Health Defense. So Bobby Kennedy is one of the lawyers who is bringing that case, Roby versus Merck. And that's a case primarily for fraud, to say that these clinical trials were fraudulent and the information that she got was fraudulent. She was not informed of the risks, and her illness is due to Gardasil.
And she is suing both Merck and her medical care providers and Kaiser, which was the HMO to which her family belonged. My question is, what role does FDA and CDC play in clinical trials? It's FDA really who has the largest role there, and they are integrally involved in clinical trials. They're involved sometimes in the design of the trials. There is data going back and forth between those who are running the trials, often the manufacturers, and FDA. So FDA is really intimately involved every step of the way. There's correspondence between them. If FDA perceives a problem, I guess they could ask questions and ask for changes. Oftentimes they seem to kind of go along with it, but we know with Gardasil that they've admitted they were involved in trial design, they had some oversight of it, and ultimately they're the ones who have to approve it. And then after FDA approves it, it goes to CDC and goes to ACIP to be added to the recommended schedule.
I don't have another question, but I'm going to add a comment to what Mary said about suing outside of the Court of Federal Claims. I didn't know that you could do that if you won a case. I didn't know that you could do that. Now, had I known, we didn't have the kind of support available. You know, Bobby Kennedy wasn't involved at that point. You know, all these high-powered California attorney law offices. The other thing is I only found out recently that I could have also sued the physicians for malpractice because of a misdiagnosis which led to you know, not getting the right tests and so forth. So, and that they could have been concurrent, as I understand it. So, but the statute of limitations is 3 years, or 2 years, might have been 2 or 3 years. So that wasn't an option, but, and I didn't mention earlier, the settlement was, not the settlement, the judgment was for $250,000, which is the most you can get for a death. It's capped at $250,000. So, but I didn't know Mary.
So another question is for countries that don't have a so-called vaccine court, how do they get compensation for vaccine injury? In other words, can other countries sue Merck or other vaccine manufacturers? So, as Emily brought across, it's very difficult to prove vaccine injury. That's the reality. It's very hard to prove causation in any kind of biological area. But yes, other countries, many other countries, several other countries, I shouldn't say many, several other countries do have injury compensation programs. The UK has an injury compensation, Norway has one, Canada is deliberating about it right now, but most countries don't. And we met with Japanese lawyers a couple weeks ago who are bringing cases on behalf of Japanese victims. We've been talking to a lawyer in Colombia. They don't have a compensation program. Cases are being filed in France, cases are being filed in Spain. There are lawsuits going on against Merck for Gardasil. But I don't want to underestimate, you know, they have good lawyers. They can pay for very good lawyers. There's lots of science, as Kim pointed out to you, that they will point to, epidemiological science, just like they did in Emily's case for Christina, saying, oh, well, 100 million doses have been given, you know, nothing's been reported like what you're saying. So it's not a slam dunk, but I am encouraged by the litigation that is happening around the world, and lawyers do talk to one another. And for instance, in Vioxx, it was lawsuits in Australia against Merck that led to discovery of documents that basically said that Merck was targeting doctors who were critical of Vioxx. Their internal correspondence said destroy them where they live. They said neutralize these ones, you know, reward these ones. And that discovery information was then very useful in the United States. So all of these litigations are going on contemporaneously. We will benefit from litigations, you know, one country to another, but I don't want to give you the misimpression that it's easy to go up against a corporation like Merck.
We should also point out that Health Canada is being ordered to turn over a lot of documents from Gardasil clinical trials to researchers. Now, that process will take a while, probably, for that turnover to happen. Health Canada's been fighting it, but there has been an order. My next question was, I thought I saw on one of your slides that AVA, aluminum-based adjuvant, was not approved for subcutaneous injection into humans, correct? Please explain. It's not approved on its own. It's approved as part of the vaccine. So when the vaccine as a whole is approved, the adjuvant is approved along with it, but they don't have to show any independent safety testing for those adjuvants before they're included in the vaccine.
Yeah, so I have one more question. Does Big Pharma have any influence in the legal arena? Big Pharma has influence everywhere. They have huge influence in the legislatures, as we're seeing across the country, right? So they can make huge campaign contributions. They can fund advocacy groups like Women in Government. That's a group of women women legislators. Women in Government, WIG, has been advocating for bills for HPV education and HPV mandates now for over 10 years. They are very, very powerful in the legislative arena, directly and indirectly. In courts, they don't have any formal role. And, you know, I do look to the federal judiciary where judges are appointed for life and their salaries cannot be reduced. I do look to the federal judiciary in particular, but also the state judiciary where judges are often elected or they may be appointed and they serve typically for 10 or 15-year terms, and it is their job to be neutral decision makers. As you know from this 86 acts with Congress that foreclosed litigation in the first instance, we've been sort of frozen out of courts for a long time. The good news is that there is the Roe v. versus Merck case in California. There's other litigation against Pharma now. You may or may not be aware that there's been a case in federal court in Pennsylvania that's been going on now for over 8 years about the MMR vaccine. So this was brought by two scientists, Kraling and I can't pronounce the other name, against Merck for falsification of the mumps component of the MMR vaccine. There's lots of outbreaks of mumps that you're not hearing about and all the measles hysteria, but there have been over 9,000 cases of reported mumps, outbreaks in many, many colleges. There's a US submarine out at sea that's being quarantined for months because so many of the people have mumps. And then if later, after any more questions about HPV, if people want, I'd be happy to give a little update about the litigation that's going on in New York about the mandates that were imposed in Rockland County and in Brooklyn.
Why don't you do that now, Mary?
Shall I do that?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so in this sort of measles hysteria that we are living in now and we've lived in before, I know Gina made comments in the Washington legislature, this is nothing new. We've seen this many times before. But in that context, the county executive in Rockland County, a county about an hour north of New York City, after some litigation started, he imposed an executive order under his emergency powers to restrict for 30 days all children who were unvaccinated against the measles from entering any public space. So children who are unvaccinated, this has nothing to do with people with measles infections. Children who are unvaccinated against measles would not be able to go to any congregating place with more than 10 people. They couldn't go to synagogue, they couldn't go to a store, they couldn't go to a church, they couldn't go to school. And the county executive, that power that he has for emergencies clearly is related to natural emergencies like a flood or a man-made disaster like Indian Point, the nuclear power plant exploding, or rioting. And his power, the executive authority, specifically says you get to declare an emergency for 5 days and then you have to re-up depending on the circumstances of the emergency. So the executive Ed Day came out in his initial order that this was an order for 30 days going past Passover, right? And most of these unvaccinated children are Orthodox Jewish or they're Hasidic. So on its face, it was very problematic. And so two attorneys on behalf of about 40 plaintiffs sued him, the county executive, in the state court for asking for a temporary restraining order that he had overreached his executive authorities. And the plaintiffs won. And there was a really thoughtful, simple, straightforward decision by the judge saying, you have powers, Mr. Executive, under your disaster authority for an epidemic, But as I understand, there's no definition in the statute for epidemic. As I understand epidemic, it would have to be a disproportionate number of the population that's been affected. And even if I count all of the cases in measles in Rockland County, which is like 156, out of a population of 300,000, that's 0.05. That doesn't constitute an epidemic. Goodbye. But not to be, he was not happy. The county executive sued again to overturn that, and he was struck down on appeal. And then it was pursued again to a panel of the appellate division, and again, it was affirmed that all the kids could be in school and they could go to public places. So that was an unqualified triumph in the era of mandates, where in general, courts have been very generous and very liberal in their interpretation of mandates. Shortly after that happened, on April 9th, the Commissioner of Health in New York City put out an order stating that in 4 zip codes in Brooklyn, in Williamsburg, with high concentrations of Orthodox Jewish people and Hasidic people, many of whom, but not just those groups, have unvaccinated children against the measles, and where there were a couple hundred cases of measles, this order said that if parents did not vaccinate themselves and their children against measles, if they didn't have documented immunity, if they didn't do that within 48 hours, they would be subject to criminal sanctions. They would be found to have committed a misdemeanor, and imprisonment was one of the criminal sanctions available. And anybody who did not vaccinate against the measles or who did not have documented immunity would be considered under law a public nuisance and detrimental to the public health. So a lawsuit was filed shortly after that, and interestingly, when that lawsuit went to court the next week on April 17th, the Department of Health, the Board of Health for New York City, had already rescinded the initial order. They had already taken off all criminal sanctions to this non-vaccination status. And they said, we are only going to be imposing civil sanctions. And in that hearing on April 17th or April 18th, the request for a temporary restraining order on behalf of 5 unvaccinated families, 3 Jewish, 2 not Jewish, that lost on behalf of the plaintiffs, and the appeal will be argued on Monday. But already the city has pulled back. However, the city has at least imposed 3 fines on families with children not vaccinated against measles of $1,000 each, and those fines are absolutely going to be litigated as well.
I'm just, because I read so much about it, and how are they enforcing that? Are they going door to door?
No.
Exactly.
So one of the remarkable things, I should say, it's a remarkable situation. So literally, it took the Board of Health 3 tries to get the 4 zip codes correct. It took them 3 tries to get the zip codes correct. And literally, in questions in Bloomberg, in major publication outlets, the Commissioner of Health admitted, or the spokesperson admitted, we have no idea how to do this. We have no blueprint. We've never done this before. So they're clearly not going door to door, which suggests that it's highly selective prosecution, which is always very, very problematic. And so the appeal, the challenge, the legal challenge, is that this is arbitrary and capricious and in violation of law. But we do know that some, fines have been imposed, and there's every likelihood that this case, which is completely based on the landmark Supreme Court case where there's a mandate on the whole population, not just kids in school, there's every reason to think that this case may be the case to challenge mandates and will go quite far in the judicial system. Uncertain, but it could be. Yeah.
I saw it reported that fine was $1,000 per day.
Yeah, and so the fine is the minimum under this part of the code of New York City. The minimum amount is $200, the maximum is $2,000, and it can be imposed every day. Some of these families will have 7, 10 children, so we could be talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. That hasn't been imposed yet, but a fine of $1,000 is grossly disproportionate to the precedent that they're relying on, which was a $5 fine in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1905, which would be $125 today. So this is just, this is being challenged, and this is not going to be over at one level. Yeah.
And the fines that are being imposed, where do you get that money?
Where would the money go? It goes to New York City. Goes to the city budget, yeah. Yes.
Everything that's happening in Oregon right now.
Right.
And I don't think it's passed just yet. I'm trying to stay up to date, but where they're stating that children won't be able to participate in other activities outside of school. If that does pass, I mean, is that something that there could be legal action from parents? Because I mean, okay, because
So I was in Oregon before coming here, and I sat in to listen to Senator Steiner Hayward explain that no, this doesn't really relate to things outside of school. Of course, these children who are unvaccinated can come to things, but of course, then another person on the panel said, well, that's not at all what the Legislative Council has said it means. And I read this statute. It certainly looks as if kids are essentially going to be, close to house arrest, what was happening in Rockland. Absolutely, all of this is going to be challenged, but I'll tell you one thing that has to happen is to start really finding lawyers in each state who are really going to be willing to bring these cases. No big firm is going to do this. Big firms do represent pharma, and they're going to be conflicted out. They're going to have conflicts of interest. They're not going to be able to represent people. So it's going to have to be small firms or solo practitioners, but it is really important that literally in states around the country we start identifying these legal teams. There's going to be a lot that's going to be in common between the states. As we know, a lot of these, proposed bills are pretty, they're pretty similar. But we're going to need lawyers in each state, and hopefully the ACLU, interestingly, did speak out against the New York City ban, which is kind of new. ACLU has not been very good on this issue. But I think as things ratchet up and the effects become more and more clear and the violations of law become more and more clear and the injuries become more and more clear, I think there will be more civil rights and human rights groups that will be coming on board. I'm hopeful of that. Yeah.
I don't know what the significance is of the Nuremberg Code.
Yeah.
Read it and I know the
Yes.
content of it,
Yeah.
but did that have any bearing on it?
So the question is, does the Nuremberg Code, which was signed at the end of World War II at the in the Nazi doctors' prosecution, where doctors, the pinnacle of science and medicine in Germany, had been perpetrating medical atrocities. And what's the significance of the Nuremberg Code? The first provision of which says the consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. And then it goes on to say there can't be coercion, there can't be duress, there can't be penalties. It has to be prior, free, and informed consent. So that directly does not have legal significance. However, it's the basis for laws around the world, including the US. So the norm in the United States and the law around experimental subjects is reasonably strong. And it's strong around treatment. And there is, I love to say, and then there's a 2005 declaration of under the United Nations for Human Rights and Bioethics that says it's not just related to experimentation, it's related to treatment. And everybody is entitled to prior, free, and informed consent for all medical interventions, including preventive ones. So I love to cite to that because we, the United States, and 193 countries signed on to the Declaration of Human Rights and Bioethics. Now, there's a slight, there's an override in Article 27 that says, yeah, in the event of an emergency, you might have, you can impose certain things, and it says that the rights of the individual supersede those of science or the society. And then it says, if there's an absolute emergency, you could impose something in, that is authorized by law, and it's the least restrictive means possible. So, but so we do not have any legal carve out for vaccine mandates and saying, oh, it's fine not to have informed consent. And so everybody in all of these hearings is talking about, informed choice and informed consent appropriately. But this 1905 landmark decision from the Supreme Court related to a population-wide mandate in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in the case of smallpox, which was a 30% fatality rate. If you came into contact with smallpox, you had a 30% chance of dying from it. Very different than today's measles and mumps and rubella outbreaks. But in that context, they did say that mandates were okay, and that was before religious exemptions. But it did say there had to be medical exemptions, and it said that it had to be proportionate, it had to be reasonable, there had to be harm avoidance, and there couldn't be any discrimination. And so that decision needs to be refined in the context of the modern mandates, which are, only imposed on kids, they're for relatively mild diseases, they're not fatal, et cetera.
one more? Yeah.
If you could speak to Texas, they were proposing a bill that doctors could not use vaccines unless they were proven safe.
Well, there's a great amendment that's proposed, there's a great bill that's been proposed in a number of states, hasn't really won anywhere yet. But it's a great draft bill, I think it's been proposed here too, that says, you know, you have to have had double-blind, placebo-controlled.
I just want to say it was our own Jacqueline Gallion in Spokane who inspired those bills. She pulled together a number of great minds in one conversation, and it led to that, and we're just so pleased to see states picking that up.
Yeah, and a number of states have proposed it, basically saying you have to have double-blind, placebo-controlled studies, you have to have tried to observe the side effects for a reasonable amount of time, you had to have a reasonable number of people in your clinical trials in that age group, all of the stuff that none of the vaccines have. So if one of those bills were to be adopted as law, all the mandates would go out the window.
So going back to those double-blind placebo-controlled studies, right? Someone asked, what is the justification for using aluminum in a placebo? So there are really two justifications that FDA has said to us about that. The first is, well, we're really looking at the safety and efficacy of the antigen, those virus-like particles. So if everyone gets aluminum, we're isolating the virus-like particles and what they do. Doesn't say anything about the safety of aluminum, right? The second justification is that the placebo with the aluminum in it looks just like the vaccine, and since it's double blind, that means not only do the participants not know who's getting what, but the people who are giving the injections don't know who's getting the placebo versus the vaccine. There are ways around that, and in fact in the Gardasil 9 trial that we mentioned, where the girls appear to have gotten saline after they got regular Gardasil, and in that small protocol 18, those young kids, what they did was they took staff who were in the clinical trial sites who didn't have any other contact with the patients, and they prepared the vaccines, and I think they may have even done something like wrap the syringes in paper so you couldn't see what was what, but they had a workaround, and then those people who had no contact other than providing the injection provided the injection so that the other staff remained blinded to who received what. So there are workarounds around that. But as we talked about before, the real effect of that is that you're masking any safety effect of the aluminum by using it as a placebo. And then we had one last question that's really for all of us, and it's, is there anything that we can do as parents to help our vaccine-injured kids medically to recover? That's so for the next month, we'll be here. None of us as doctors, of course.
We'll be having more medical conferences in the future.
There are lots of different things that I'm sure a lot of parents here could talk about that parents have tried. I will say that one thing that people talk about using for aluminum toxicity is high silica water. That silica binds to aluminum and can help carry it out of the body. So waters like Fiji water is one, and there are others. I've heard that you can't make your own silica water, though. I actually asked that question.
I have a lawyer question. What would you say to someone in particular, even a nurse, who tells you that inserts are lawyer jargon?
What?
Laugh. It's not lawyer jargon.
No.
It's required by law.
Yeah.
Okay. It should be for nurses and doctors to use.
So you can use it as a medical resource. Great.
And they're written by the manufacturers about their own product.
For the doctors.
For the doctors.
For the doctors.
It's just that it's often the parents who are reading them.
What's the best use of our money?
That's a good segue.
There you go. Obviously, you're for work here in the state, I'd give it to Informed Choice Washington. Here. Informed Choice Washington. On the national level, I would give it, if you want legal challenges on a national level, I would give it to Children's Health Defense, which is Bobby Kennedy's group.
How do you get paid?
I want to just say that these ladies generously came here, and while we did fund their coming, they asked for nothing. They travel the country and do this. I don't know how they're not starving and paying their bills. If you guys have other organizations that you feel you want donations to, that would be,
like I said, organization that's really trying to explore the legal avenues to change this.
Thank you.
I'm going to just say really quick, first of all, a great big thank you, so I don't forget to our wonderful you know, this movement is unlike any other movement in the world. I'm going to just have to say, we love you. You know, this is heart to heart. You know, thank you for being here. Okay, so the question about healing on our website, informedchoicelaw.org, under resources, we do have some good links. It's a good place to start. Resources on healing from chronic childhood disorders. There's some really good places just to at least begin your investigation and to reach out. Another good place for money is, I will go back one page. We are almost done funding the vaxxed versus unvaxxed study. Dr. James Lyons-Weiler at IPAC, Institute for Pure and Applied Knowledge, is doing a fantastic vaxxed unvaxxed study. It's data that exists, and he's beginning now. So it's going to be tremendous when we get the results of this. And as soon as this is fully funded, we're going to be flipping over to helping another fantastic prospective study funding. So watch for that to come next, because we are going to generate our own independent research that is going to be beautifully done and so tight they won't be able to pick it apart, because we'll have truth there. What was the other
Action
thing?
team?
Oh, the action team. So on our website also, if you go to the Donate and Join page, you can join our action team. And, you know, you don't have to donate to join the action team. If you're in a place of life you can, wonderful, but if not, you can just go ahead and become an action member, sign up, let us know your skills. Life has been crazy, as you guys know, in the past several months, and we have had just this huge outpouring of volunteers come forward. I want to help, and we're so grateful. A lot of you have signed up on the action team, and we'd like even more people to do that. And I want to promise you that now that we can take a deep breath, we're going to do our best to get organized in order to bring you all in and really get some structure going. If you don't hear from us in a reasonable amount of time, nag us. Say, hey, I volunteered. How come I'm not doing anything for you? You nag us, okay? But we really want to have this amazing grassroots level, so that moving forward, this is the most powerful informed consent, informed choice state in the union. We want to set an example. Real quick question.
Can Informed Choice Washington start doing some meetups so we can have more social involvement?
Informed Choice Washington do meetups with, yes, we can do that. You nag me with an email, so we keep on top of that. Thank you guys.
Are you ready for me to
Was there
finish
something
it?
else?
We went to the car and got more books, so those of you who were not able to buy books or who want to buy a couple more books, we have those back there as well, or donate to get the books.
More books. So we're past our time, so I'm going to say goodbye. Thank you.